Chapter 31, 1942, Val-les-Deux, France. Marjorie awoke in the dead of night. Quietly, so she wouldn't wake Sophie, she slipped off her straw pallet and splashed her face with not-so-fresh water from a large basin. Shivering a little, she put on her skirt and sweater. Madame Pinget had recently washed them, bringing them back to the cellar with the most recent food supply. Marjorie's shiver dissolved in a tickle of pleasure at the luxury of fresh-smelling, clean clothes. She padded up the staircase, unlocked the door to the wine cellar, and peered out into the main room to make sure it was empty. She was always afraid that one day one of the workers was going to sample too much of the product on the job, fall asleep amid the funnels and barrels and vats, and wake up to find her or Sophie coming up out of the cellar. Marjorie made a stealthy tour of the room, tiptoeing around the wine-making equipment. She was alone. She relaxed a bit, clambering onto a barrel under one of the high windows. She balanced on top of it, looking up and out at the night sky. It was clear, the heavens full of stars. Marjorie focused on the brightest one and made the wish that filled her every moment. May peace come quickly, and may Sophie and I be free, and may Dad be safe, she whispered to the night. She remained perched on her lookout for a while longer, savoring the open sky. How she longed to walk beneath the stars, to feel the wind on her face, the soft ground beneath her feet. When she had first arrived, she and Sophie had often taken nighttime walks around the winery, staying close by the building, protected by its shadow. But one night they had come around the side of the building and found themselves face to face with a man they didn't recognize. They had said hello and continued around the winery again, pressing against the side of the building to watch and wait, their hearts pounding in their ears. Marjorie had peered around the corner of the building and seen the man go inside. A few minutes later, he had emerged holding a straw basket that he hadn't had when he'd gone in. A worker who'd forgotten something? Marjorie and Sophie had watched the man cross the vineyard toward the farmhouse. Not until he was a distant speck in the night did they dare to go back inside and down to the cellar. After that, they hadn't ventured out again. They had spent night after night in terror, afraid the worker might say something to the wrong person. Even after days and weeks had passed, they were frightened. They no longer spent their nights running around in the big wine-making room upstairs, or telling each other stories by the light of the moon that came in through the high windows. Sometimes they allowed themselves a few minutes upstairs to stretch their legs or to look briefly out at the night, but they always returned quickly to the cellar. There, they dared only to imagine they were outside the single room that had become the limit of their world. Marjorie climbed down off the barrel and went back downstairs. She could hear Sophie stirring under her blanket. "Marjorie?" Sophie's voice floated in the dark. "Good morning," Marjorie said, even though it was the middle of the night. They had learned to sleep to the sounds of the winery in operation, waking up to begin their day when everyone else's day was coming to an end. It was much safer that way. Marjorie felt around on the floor near her sleeping pallet for the matchbox. She lit a candle and the bottle-lined room flickered into view. "Shall we have the last of the rolls Monsieur Duclos brought for breakfast?" Monsieur Duclos owned the winery and the farmhouse. He was the only person besides Madame Pinget who knew about the girls. Since their arrival, only Monsieur Duclos brought bottles up or down the stairs. The rest of the time, their door was locked to any worker who might want to investigate the vintage wines aging in the cellar. Sophie sat up and stretched her arms. "I'm going to pretend my role is a fresh croissant with blackberry jam, and that I'm having it with a huge cup of hot chocolate made with steamed milk at a little cafe overlooking a long beach." Marjorie took 2 hard, stale rolls from a box that served as their pantry, putting them on the plank of wood that was their table. She set out a small piece of cheese and a jug of water, too. 1 croissant and hot chocolate, mademoiselle. Sophie got out of bed. That chocolate smells so good. And can you hear the waves down on the beach, Marjorie? I love that sound. Marjorie shut her eyes and tried to hear the waves breaking rhythmically on the shore. All that filled her ears was the silence of the cellar. She opened her eyes and sighed. I just can't do it today, she said. How can we keep making up our silly fantasies day after day when the whole world is coming to an end? Sophie took a swig of water from the jug. Marjorie, we have to do these things, or the enemy will have claimed 2 more victims. Marjorie broke off a piece of her stale roll. But I want to do something real for once, something that makes a difference, like my father was doing, like Jock is doing. She felt a little tingle as she mentioned Sophie's brother. Sophie talked so often of him, Marjorie felt almost as if she knew him, as if he were a special friend. Tell me about him again, Sophie, she said. Tell me all about what Jock is doing for France, and what he is like. Jock! Sophie threw her arms around the young man standing in the middle of their cellar. Jock, you're alive! You're safe! Tears streamed down her cheeks. In the whole year they had spent together, Marjorie had never seen Sophie cry before. It's so wonderful to see you, she sobbed. You too, mon petit chou, Jock replied tenderly. In the soft candlelight, Marjorie saw he had Sophie's delicate features and big blue eyes, but his hair was full and dark, and he was tall and broad-shouldered. Marjorie watched Sophie's reunion with him shyly. It had been a year since she and Sophie had seen anyone besides Madame Pinget and Monsieur Duclos, and now here was Jock in their secret home. Jock, a hero of the resistance, a hero of France. What's more, he was by far the most handsome boy she had ever seen. Jock finally unwrapped his arms from around his sister's shoulders and turned to Marjorie. His smile made her warm all over. Sophie, he said, not taking his eyes off Marjorie, I know you don't get many visitors down here, but you haven't forgotten your manners, have you? Oh, I'm sorry, Sophie said. Jock, Marjorie, Marjorie, Jock. Hello, Jock said, holding Marjorie's gaze. Hi, she said softly. Thank you for taking such good care of my little sister for me, he said. She's taken just as good care of me, Marjorie said, pulling away from the spell of Jock's gaze to flash Sophie a smile. I feel as if we've become almost, well, this is how I imagine it would be if I had a sister. Sophie grinned. Madame Pinget says we even look alike. What do you think, Jock? I think you're the 2 most beautiful hideaways I've ever seen, he said. Marjorie blushed, feeling his eyes still on her. But I long to see the day when you don't have to hide, he added, his voice growing serious and sad. Which is why I'm here. Marjorie, I hear you want to help us, help the resistance. Oh, I've wanted to help more than anything, Marjorie said. But how did you know? I told Madame Pinget, Sophie explained. And she told me, Jock said. You see, we need someone to help transmit radio messages to our allies, to Britain and the United States, someone who speaks fluent English and French. Like me, Marjorie said, feeling a flutter of nerves and excitement. And I know a lot about radio. I used to listen to it all the time back in California. Well, this is a different kind of radio, Jack said. You'd be transmitting in code. It's extremely dangerous. When do I begin? Marjorie said, without hesitating. Jock took a step toward her. Marjorie, he said softly, the last radio operator was captured. That's why we need somebody new. I want you to understand that fully before you make a decision. Marjorie nodded solemnly, her excitement tempered by a shrill note of fear. But her mind was made up. I do understand, she told Jock, and I want you to understand that my other choice is to do nothing. Nothing to win my own freedom. Nothing to win Sophie's. Nothing to help your country or mine. I've been dreaming of this chance, Jock. and there's no question about what I want to do." "Marjorie, you are a brave woman," said Jock. Marjorie tingled at the sound of her name on his lips. No one had ever called her a woman before. She looked into Jock's deep blue eyes, and in the candlelight she saw her own reflection. Marjorie Lewis, a woman of the French resistance. 2 short taps, 3 long ones. Marjorie worked the key on her radio transmitter, trying to remember everything she had been taught. Her head swam with all the new information. She prayed she had gotten the secret code right. There had been no study sheets, no books or manuals. Crib notes, hidden under her sleeve the way some of the girls at school used to do, were out of the question. Writing down the code was far too dangerous. What if it fell into the wrong hands? Everything Marjorie learned had to be committed to memory, with no room for mistakes. It was a cram course on which lives depended. Carefully, she translated her message into coded taps, sending it over the airwaves to a fellow resistance fighter. "Dynamite received," she transmitted. "Bridge sabotage plan for 0300 hours." Marjorie glanced at her wristwatch. She couldn't allow herself more than a few minutes to send her message, or the enemy might be able to trace her transmission. She thought about the last radio operator, the one Jock had told her had been captured. A chill ran through her. Quickly, she signed off, tapping out her code name, North Star. She had chosen it because back in Sweet Valley, she had learned about the slaves on the Underground Railroad who had used the North Star to guide them to freedom. And the Resistance was a kind of Underground Railroad for her own time, wasn't it? Marjorie waited for the return tapping that meant her message had been received. Then she closed the channel on her radio immediately. Around her were large baskets full of juicy plums and ripening tomatoes and tender green heads of lettuce. The grocer who owned this little shop was a friend of the Resistance, and he had agreed to let Marjorie make this evening's transmission from his stockroom after the store had closed for the evening. Sitting at a rickety old table the grocer had set up, she began to take apart the radio. Piece by piece she packed it into her schoolgirl's book bag. As soon as she was finished, she slung her bag onto her back and left the shop by the back door. The night was frigid, the sharp, tangy smell of winter riding a light breeze. There was no moon, and Marjorie had to strain to see her way down the street that led away from the shop. Sometimes she felt as if she had lived her whole life in darkness, as if daylight were a dream she had had long before, or something she and Sophie had made up in one of their games of Imagine. Poor Sophie. Marjorie hated to think of her all alone in the wine cellar. No one to talk to day after day. No one she could tell her dreams or fears to. But Sophie had been so brave when Marjorie left. "Don't worry about me for a second," she had said. "I want you to do this as much as you want to do it. I just wish I could be part of it myself." "Sophie, it's too dangerous and you're too young," Jock had said firmly. "It's too dangerous for you too," Sophie had retorted. "And when do I stop being too young?" Jock had taken Sophie's hands. "By that time, I hope there will be no need for a secret war. By that time, I hope we'll all be living in safety and peace." Safety, peace. Those things seemed as distant as daylight, Marjorie thought, as she followed the road toward the spot where she and Jock had arranged to meet. Her step picked up. Jock! He was her shelter from the darkness and danger. Seeing him almost seemed to make her fears temporarily vanish. Marjorie slipped into the daydream that kept her going as she lived in hiding, moving from one secret spot to another and facing danger every time she turned her radio on. In her daydream, the war was over. The Allies had won. She and Jock were happily married and had a little house in Val-les-Deux. Sophie lived next door. "Stop," Marjorie scolded herself. This was just another game of Imagine. She didn't know if Jock felt the same way she did, and she didn't even know how to tell. In all the books Madame Pinget had brought them in the wine cellar, girls and boys were constantly falling in love, but so far, Marjorie's experience with romance had been all in her imagination. Maybe what she and Jock shared went no further than their work with the Resistance. He was her control. The person in her cell who knew her real identity, who gave her assignments, and to whom she passed along any information she received over her radio. No one else in her cell knew who North Star really was. It was safer this way. The enemy had its nightmarish ways of getting prisoners to talk, and it was dangerous for anyone to know too much. Like all resistance members, Marjorie had a special relationship with her control. Jock was the only person who could be trusted with her life. But maybe when Marjorie's work with the resistance was over, it would be the end of her relationship with Jock, too. Or maybe he thought of her as a little sister. Maybe he had some beautiful secret agent girlfriend somewhere. "Your papers, Fraulein?" a deep voice said in Marjorie's ear. German soldiers, 2 of them. Marjorie had been so lost in thought she hadn't seen them in the shadows of the road. She made a silent note to herself. Never ever daydream when danger could be lurking up ahead. Her heart pounded so loudly it was a miracle the soldiers couldn't hear it. "Act calm," Marjorie reminded herself. "You are an innocent schoolgirl. There's absolutely nothing wrong." Good evening, messieurs," she managed to say. She dug into the pocket of her coat and produced the false identification papers that the resistance had issued her. One of the soldiers, flashlight in hand, took the papers and studied them carefully. "Marie Saint Sault," he read. He glanced at the picture on the papers and then at her face. His eyes traveled over her schoolgirl's uniform. "When is your birthday, Mademoiselle Saint Saul?" Marjorie recited the date she knew was printed on the documents. The soldier nodded. He was tall and had a round, pink baby face, but his expression was hard. He couldn't have been any older than Jock. "Well, Mademoiselle Saint Saul, it's almost curfew time. School has been over for hours," he said. Marjorie felt the weight of the radio and the book bag strapped to her back. "I went to meet my boyfriend after school." She looked right into the soldier's chubby-cheeked face and forced herself to give him her most charming smile. "My parents don't approve," she said, lowering her voice as if confiding a huge secret. "So please don't tell anyone." Babyface exchanged a glance with the other soldier. Marjorie felt a beat of indecision pass between them. Keeping the smile plastered on her face, she reached out and actually touched the young soldier's sleeve. A shudder ran through her as her fingers made contact with the gray cloth of the hated uniform. But Marjorie made herself laugh. "You know how it is," she said. "Parents." Babyface's tight expression began to soften. He chuckled, raising an eyebrow at the other soldier. His partner cracked a smile, too. Babyface handed Marjorie's papers back to her and waved her on. She was safe, at least for the moment. "I saw the whole thing," Jock said, "from my hiding place. I saw them patrolling the road. I came to warn you, but they found you before I did. I saw them stop you. I was terrified." Jock held Marjorie's hands in his, whispering under the shadow of a large tree. "But you were as cool as could be." Marjorie trembled at Jock's touch. This near to him, she didn't feel the least bit cool. Her face was flushed, and she felt warm all over, especially where his hand rested on top of hers. "You were a real professional back there on the road, Marjorie," Jock said. "You were wonderful." He drew even closer to her. "You are wonderful." Marjorie turned her face up to his. She could see a sparkle in his eyes. She could feel the warmth of his skin. "Kiss me," she thought. "Please kiss me. Let's share one bit of joy in all this madness and horror." Jock's lips met hers. He kissed her tentatively, softly. Marjorie kissed him back with all the passion that had fueled her deepest daydreams. Their kisses deepened. The world seemed to stop. All the terror and loss dissolved in the sweetness of their embrace. And for those lingering moments, Marjorie and Jock were just 2 people falling in love, the horror of war forgotten. Chapter 32. Marjorie's radio hummed and clicked as she received a message. 5 short taps, 1 long one. CH. 2 more long ones. A. Charles, she spelled out, decoding as the message came in. Charles Robertson and Martin Feld arrived safely Barcelona, the complete message said. From her secret nest of straw in a farm silo, Marjorie smiled. Every message like this was a victory. Charles Robertson and Marvin Feld were two young American pilots who had been shot down over Marjorie's sector and had bailed out of their burning plane by parachute. They had landed near Val-les-Deux, where they had been picked up by members of Marjorie's cell. The resistance had arranged for them to be smuggled to Spain. From there they were free to return to America. Guiding the beam of her flashlight to her radio, Marjorie tapped out the code for message received. As she worked, she remembered Charles Robertson's strong-boned, handsome face, ripped open by flying metal as his plane had been hit. She remembered the hollow terror in his deep-set eyes. She wished as hard as she could that his wound was healing and that his terror had softened with the passing weeks. Did he have a girlfriend to take care of him back in the United States? Marjorie hoped so. She pictured a happy Charles Robertson knocking on the door of her Aunt Amanda's house in Sweet Valley, as he had promised he'd do. She pictured her aunt's face lighting up as she heard that Marjorie was safe. But as she thought about her aunt, Marjorie's game of imagine took a sad turn. When would she see Aunt Amanda again? When would she hear her voice? Marjorie began taking apart her radio and packing it into her school bag. Sometimes it was best not to wish or imagine. Sometimes it hurt too much, as it did when Marjorie thought about her father or her aunt. She hadn't heard anything about her father since the day he had disappeared. She didn't even know if he was dead or alive. Marjorie played Imagine less and less these days. She had a new, real happiness to fill her days now. Thank goodness for Jock, she thought, pulling on her coat, grabbing the bag that held her radio, and making sure she left no trace of her visit in the silo. She hurried across a grassy field illuminated by a crescent moon and followed a stone wall to her rendezvous with Jock. Her quick step became a run when she saw him waiting in the trickle of moonlight. She threw her arms around him, and as always, the world around her fell away in the space of a kiss. "Marjorie," Jock murmured, drawing her close. "Marjorie, I love you." "Jock, oh, I love you too." Marjorie melted into the tender strength of his hug. "But how can this be happening to us? How can we be falling in love in the middle of all the hate, the fear, the death?" "Because," Jock said, punctuating his words with kisses, "we are human. We must see the hope. That's how we will win." Tears streamed down Marjorie's face as she sat in the back room of a village pharmacy decoding the incoming message. "No," she sobbed. "Oh, no." Sophie Berg arrested. Enemy searching for Helene Pinget. Marjorie's body shook with sobs as she struggled to break down the coded message letter by letter. "Also searching for M.A." came the taps. Good heavens! Marjorie! The transmission spelled out Marjorie. The enemy knew about her, knew she had been hiding with Sophie until recently. They were looking for her. Marjorie wiped at her tears as the message kept coming in. Lewis Girl sought as vital link to getting information from American agent Jack Lewis. The news split through her storm of unhappiness. Her father was alive, but the slim ray of joy could not evaporate her tears for Sophie. Conflicting feelings thundered inside her as she decoded the rest of the message. Agent Lewis, suspected of planning his own arrest to work within the walls of prisoner of war camp. Arrested on purpose! Marjorie's head spun. Her father was every inch a hero. Suddenly, Marjorie had an idea for securing Sophie's freedom. "Turn you over to the enemy?" Jock asked. He held Marjorie close. "Never!" His voice echoed in the empty chapel where they were being hidden for the night. "But Jock, it's the only way to get Sophie back," Marjorie insisted. "If they want the information from my father badly enough, and it sounds like they do, it will be worth the trade. Me and the power they'll have over my father once they have me, for your sister's freedom." Jock tightened his hug, as if Marjorie might vanish at any second. "And then what? What do you think happens once they realize you know nothing about your father's work?" Marjorie was silent. The little stone chapel was cold and damp. "No," Jock said. "I won't allow it." Marjorie let go of him. "And if I decide to do it anyway?" Jock gave a bitter laugh. How will you do that? Will you turn yourself into one of those Swinish Germans and tell him you want to be swapped for one of the other prisoners? A lot of good it will do, Sophie, once you're in enemy hands. He shook his head. No, it would require all the help and skill and delicate planning of our entire cell, and I am your only link to them. Then you have to help me, Marjorie said, or are you just going to accept that you may never see your little sister again? Jock's face was a mask of misery and pain. I'll figure something out, he said. What? There's no other way. But Jock was unmovable. I'll never let you go, he said. But what about Sophie? Marjorie said miserably. If only there was some way we could trick them, make them think they were going to get me in exchange for her, and then, I don't know. Her sigh of frustration rose up toward the vaulted chapel ceiling. Wait! Jock's voice took on a ripple of hope. Marjorie, that's it. What if we pretended we were willing to make the trade, but once Sophie was safe, there was a little change in plan? Marjorie kept her optimism in check. And how would you work a scheme like that? The Germans will be much too careful to let me slip through their fingers. Besides, you can't go to the enemy either. You're in as much danger as I am. That's true, Jock said, but I know someone in Val-les-Deux who collaborates with the Germans. Pierre Trichet. He used to be a classmate of mine. Marjorie nodded. Many Frenchmen and women were collaborationists. That was one of the things that made occupied France so dangerous for her and Jock. Well, Jock continued, perhaps we could take Pierre's twisted loyalty and turn it to our advantage. I could contact him and arrange for a secret meeting. I convinced Pierre that he would be a hero, Jock said triumphantly. He and Marjorie huddled inside an old shed that smelled of wood and damp earth. Rain beat on the roof. One Jewish girl, I said to him. A Jew means nothing. You know that. Our lives are worthless to the Germans. Certainly they would be willing to let one worthless soul go free in exchange for someone who will unlock the secrets of the United States of America. And what did he say to that? Marjorie asked. Well, he seemed embarrassed. I think he looked up to me when we were in school. Always picked me to be on his soccer team, and things like that. Now here I was saying that I was worth nothing to the people he had sided with. Marjorie rested her head on Jock's shoulder. It must have been terrible to have to talk to a traitor like that. Jock sighed. I don't know. I don't think it's as easy as that. You might think Pierre is some kind of a monster, but he's really just a simple person. He takes orders from the people who are giving them. Right now, that means the Germans. And people die. People are murdered. Yes, people die, Jock said, but not this time. Pierre doesn't know it, but he's going to help save a girl's life. Tell me how, Marjorie said. Tell me everything. Jock nodded. Well, as I said, first I made Pierre see that Sophie was worth nothing to the Germans and that they'd be glad to trade her for you. Collaborationist though he is, he's still the impressionable boy I once knew. We talked over old times, and he is quite willing, I think, to have an excuse to reunite me with my sister. Maybe it makes him feel less like he's betraying our country, Jock said. And then, Marjorie prompted. Then I explained how we would make the trade at the train station. I told him he would have to get the Germans to provide all the proper false papers to assure Sophie's safe passage to Spain. Pierre agreed to talk to one of the German higher-ups in Val-les-Deux, and we arranged to meet the next day. Which was yesterday, right? Marjorie asked. Jock nodded again. And did you meet him? Jock nodded and reached into a secret pocket that had been sewn into the lining of his coat. Voila! Papers for Sophie. Marjorie took the papers from him. A photo of Sophie seemed to jump out at her from the documents. Sophie. She looked so drawn and frightened, her big eyes even bigger with fear. Marjorie stifled a cry of alarm. I know. She looks awful. I wonder what they have done to her. Jock let out a long breath. But you have to keep thinking that soon she will be free. Free. When? Marjorie asked. Looking at her friend's picture, no time seemed soon enough. The day after tomorrow, Jock said. Pierre is to bring Sophie to the train station, and I am to bring you. We'll give Sophie her papers and put her on the train that will be waiting. Then Pierre thinks I will hand you over, and he will deliver his prize to his German superiors. That is where our people who work for the railroad come in. But surely the Germans will follow Pierre to the station now that they know of his plans. Surely that is why they agreed to issue Sophie papers at all. They'll try to stop the train. They'll try to take all three of us. Jock nodded. I'm sure that's so, and our people will be ready. Chapter 33. Marjorie saw Sophie at the front of the train platform, and her heart filled with joy. She was really there. Sophie, who had been Marjorie's sole companion for a year of her life. Sophie, whom she loved like a sister. The younger girl looked thin. Her fair hair framed a pale, gaunt face. A chubby young man about Jock's age held her tightly by the arm. Pierre Trichet! He looked as though he was clutching her tightly enough to raise a bruise. Marjorie wanted to shout Sophie's name out loud and run up the platform with her arms outstretched, but she couldn't call attention to herself until Sophie was safely on the train that now sat on the tracks. Besides, if everything went according to plan, they would be having a reunion soon enough. Jock and Marjorie emerged from the shadows of the station house and walked up the platform toward Pierre and Jock's sister. Marjorie's legs felt weak from nervousness, but she willed herself forward, keeping her back straight, her head up. Jock held her arm as though she had to be prevented from escaping, but his grip was gentle and gave her courage as she walked toward Pierre and Sophie. When they reached them, Jock nodded to Pierre and took Sophie from him gently. He and Sophie embraced, and Sophie cast a quick but loving glance at Marjorie, averting her gaze a split second later. Marjorie felt the tears welling in her eyes. But their tender moment didn't last long. There was very little time. Jock handed his sister her papers and helped her onto the train. Around Marjorie, several passengers said their farewells to their families, handing suitcases up to a train conductor and climbing onto the train. An older couple who had just gotten off gave their suitcases to a uniformed baggage clerk who loaded them into his wheeled cart. Pierre Trichet was reaching out for her, eager to secure his conquest. Marjorie felt herself recoil. Her legs didn't want to carry her any further, but Jock encouraged her with a loving look, the silent strength and caring in his eyes, helping Marjorie take the final steps into Pierre's rough grasp. Let's go, mademoiselle, Pierre said, pulling her from the solid warmth of Jock's gaze. As soon as he began to drag her away, Marjorie heard the sound of squeaky, rumbling wheels. Pierre heard it too. He tried to jump out of the path of the baggage cart, yanking Marjorie along with him, but he wasn't fast enough. The baggage boy threw his whole weight behind the loaded cart, aiming right for Pierre. Pierre cried out, his grip on Marjorie breaking as he was knocked to the ground. Marjorie had rehearsed the next step over and over in her mind. She ran as hard as she could toward the head of the train and jumped on board. In her mental rehearsal, Jock was always right behind her, but it was not his footfall on the metal step of the train that she heard. As she turned for a view of the platform, an explosion of gunfire rang out from several directions at once. Jock was running toward her, the sound of his steps swallowed by the chilling thunder crack of rifle shots. This was not in the plan. German soldiers were flooding into the train platform from both ends. Immediately, a smaller number of armed men in street clothes materialized around them, jumping from the roof of the station and from between train cars. French resistance fighters. Both sides unleashed a torrent of bullets, the station filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jock disappeared from Marjorie's view amid the chaos of people running and shouting and screaming. "Jock!" she cried, but his name was lost in a shrill blast from the locomotive whistle. Marjorie could feel the train moving. No, not yet. Oh no, not without Jock. Jock, hurry! She grabbed onto the rail with one hand, leaning out of the train, ready to help pull Jock up with the other hand. But the train kept moving. Marjorie looked back. The confusion was beginning to die down. Casualties from both sides were slumped on the station platform. Marjorie felt the scream boiling up from deep within her. Jock was lying in a pool of blood. No, God, no! It couldn't be. Jock's motionless body grew smaller and smaller as the train pulled away. Marjorie and Sophie sobbed. Behind the closed door of their train compartment, they held each other, their bodies shaking with shock and sorrow. Marjorie's blouse was wet from both their tears. It was never supposed to be this way, she cried, forcing her words out between heaving sobs. You were supposed to live next door to Jock and me. Her voice rose in a wail of grief as she pronounced Jock's name. Oh, how could it be true? How could Jock be dead? She had kissed his warm lips just that morning, felt the love in his eyes only minutes earlier. Sophie's silent flood of tears gave way to a heart-breaking lament of grief. They're gone, she cried, her face twisted in the most intense anguish. My whole family gone, dead. She rocked in Marjorie's arms. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have you. Oh, Marjorie, at least I have you. Sophie's words hit Marjorie hard. Sophie, you know I'll be your family. You know I'll be your friend always, but you're going to have to be brave by yourself for a while. She swallowed back her own tears as she spoke. Sophie's cries seemed to freeze in her throat. By myself? Marjorie nodded. I can't do anything about it. We have a person working on this train who's helped us. We'll be slowing down soon. That's where my ride ends. That's the place where Jock and I were supposed to jump off together. Sophie grabbed Marjorie's hands. But why can't we both travel to freedom? Don't leave me. You're the only person I have now. Sophie, I don't have papers to travel, Marjorie explained. I'll be taken off the train at the border. No, I have to do what was planned, even without Jock. She felt herself choke up. I wanted to stay and fight with him, but I don't know how I will have the courage without him. Where do you get off? Sophie asked quickly. Where will the train slow down? About 20 kilometers outside Val-les-Deux. We should be there soon. The train whistle will blow. Why? In the blink of an eye, Sophie pulled her hands away from Marjorie's, yanked open the door to the train compartment, and bolted out. Sophie? Marjorie said, getting to her feet. The door slammed shut, separating the two girls. As Marjorie reached for the door handle, she heard a faint metal-on-metal sound coming from the lock. She tried to pull the door open, but the latch would not give way. Don't bother, Sophie's voice came from the other side of the door. I jammed it with a hairpin. Have you gone mad? Marjorie shrieked through the door. Was her friend cracking under her load of grief? Marjorie heard something being slid under the door a fraction of a second before she saw it. The hollow-eyed photo of Sophie stared up at her from the set of false identification papers. Take them, Sophie told her. We look enough alike. Take them and find freedom. You've been enough of a heroine already. The enemy wants you too much. Go back to your country. Go back to your aunt whom you miss so much. Go where it's safe. Sophie, you can't do this, Marjorie cried. Your brother wanted you to use those papers. Do it for him. Let me keep on with my work. No, they're looking for you. It's too dangerous. You've done everything you can. Save yourself. Now it's my turn to fight. But it's dangerous for you too, Marjorie protested. Let me out. Come on, open the door. Marjorie, France is my country, and I want to do something for her, just as you did. Jock and I said I was too young, but he's gone, and it's time for me to try to carry on for him. Please, let me. Marjorie jiggled the door handle. Then she leaned on it with all her weight. The door wouldn't open. I don't think I have much choice, she said. No, you don't. The train whistle punctuated Sophie's sentence. Goodbye, Marjorie. I love you, she said. Her footsteps sounded down the train corridor, growing fainter and fainter. Marjorie could feel the train slowing down. She looked out her window just in time to see Sophie hit the ground, tuck into a somersault, and roll into the cover of the bushes that grew along the tracks. It was as if she had been jumping off trains all her life, as if she were already a seasoned resistance fighter. Marjorie blew Sophie a kiss, even though she knew her friend couldn't see her. Sophie would be met by other members of the resistance. They would be her only family now. Marjorie picked up the false identification papers and put them in her coat pocket. She was going to Spain, and from there, home to Sweet Valley, to her aunt, to liberty. The lush green countryside of France rolled by her window. She was going home, but her heart would stay here, buried with Jock forever. Chapter 34, 1949, Sweet Valley, California. The strains of Here Comes the Bride floated to the back of the chapel. Marjorie's heart soared. "Ready?" her father asked. His tuxedo was decorated with a pink and white orchid on one lapel. On the other, he proudly wore his medal for bravery during the war. "Ready," Marjorie said, taking a deep breath to calm her nervous excitement. "You look so beautiful, sweetheart." He moved her lacy veil to one side and kissed her cheek. Then he patted it back in place and took her arm. The California sun streamed into the chapel through stained glass windows, warming the aisle with softly colored light. Marjorie and her father stepped forward, and the billowy satin folds of Marjorie's white gown took on a pale rose hue. A few more steps down the aisle, and the rose changed to blue. Marjorie felt as if she were sliding down a rainbow, and at the end was a pot of gold, the man she loved. She could see him waiting for her, his face radiant with happiness. The chapel was filled with everyone Marjorie cared for. Her father escorted her past Madame Pinget and Sophie, who had come all the way from France for the wedding. Madame Pinget beamed proudly, and Sophie gave her a feisty thumbs-up sign. This was no game of imagine. This was true happiness. Across the aisle from them, at the front of the chapel, Marjorie's Aunt Amanda dabbed at happy tears with the edge of a handkerchief. She had told Marjorie that she knew what it was like to nurse a broken heart for many, many long years, and that she had always prayed fate would not have the same thing in store for her niece. Well, it didn't. Of course, Marjorie would always love Jock, but she had found a new love. Now Marjorie could only wish that her aunt would somehow find the same happiness. Next to her Aunt Amanda sat her Grandpa Taylor and her Grandma Jessamine. Grandma was as stylish as ever in a wide-brimmed forest green velvet hat that made her look far younger than her years. Behind them were Marjorie's Uncle Harry and his wife, Aunt Stephanie, along with their children, Peter and Stevie. They had gotten in from New York the night before. Marjorie felt a tremendous amount of love around her. She floated on the special feeling all the way to the altar of the chapel, her eyes meeting the eyes of her husband-to-be. Her father let go of her elbow. He gave Marjorie one more kiss and slid into his seat next to Aunt Amanda. The handsome groom reached out toward Marjorie. The very tips of their fingers touched, and electric happiness flowed between them. Marjorie took her place next to him at the altar. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here together to join this woman, Marjorie Lewis, and this man, Charles Robertson, in holy matrimony." Marjorie sneaked a sideways look at Charles. His face shone with joy. The faint scar that ran down one side of it would always remind Marjorie of how he had fallen from the sky, but the war wound was only a trace now. Marjorie felt as if it was the same way inside her. She would always carry a trace of the war and of Jock, carved in her memory like the everlasting petals of the wooden rose Aunt Amanda had given her. But time had healed her wounds and brought her happiness. Chapter 35. "Wow, the first American to orbit the Earth," Alice said. "Isn't it incredible?" "Well, it would have been even better if we could have seen what John Glenn was seeing instead of that dumb drawing of a space capsule they kept putting on the TV," Alice's older sister, Nancy, said. "Nancy, you were supposed to use your imagination," Alice said. "I mean, imagine what the Earth must look like from space. It must be so beautiful." Nancy made a face. So why couldn't they have shown a drawing of the Earth instead of that stupid space capsule? Their mother switched off the TV set and sighed. "Girls, I let you stay home to watch history taking place, not to fight with each other." "Yeah," echoed Laura, the girl's younger sister. "We got to stay home because something like this doesn't happen every day. We can listen to you guys fighting any time we want. Right, Mom?" Alice caught Nancy's eye. There was an unspoken truce between them. In order to team up against the common enemy, they both glared at their little sister. But their mother took Laura's side. That's right, dear. Putting a man in orbit is the beginning of the exploration of a whole new world. Space, she marveled. When I was a girl in France, it was a place you could get to only in your wildest dreams. Now there's even talk of putting a man on the moon. I'm going to be an astronaut when I grow up, Laura announced. Alice and Nancy looked at each other and rolled their eyes. The day before, Laura was going to be a nurse. The week before, a ballerina. I think that's very exciting, dear, their mother told Laura encouragingly. Space is the new frontier. Frontier? Laura asked. What's that? A place to explore, Alice explained. For instance, 100 years ago, the new frontier meant packing up all your possessions and moving west across the country. The way my great-grandmother Alice Larson did, their mother added. The one who I was named for? Alice asked. Right, her mother said. Alice Larson was the one who had those twin girls, Nancy put in. You mean Great-Aunt Amanda and her sister? Laura asked. No, dummy, Nancy said. The first Alice was the mother of Jessamine and Elizabeth, the ones who lived in Minnesota. Jessamine was the mother of Great-Aunt Amanda and her twin sister, Samantha. Right, their mother said. And your real grandmother, my mother, was Samantha. She died when I was born, so Amanda, my aunt, became like a mother to me. Oh, yeah, I knew that, Nancy said. Great-Aunt Amanda told us the whole story once, remember? I don't remember it, Alice said. I must have been too young. Anyway, it's kind of confusing. She tried to get all the grandparents and great-grandparents straight in her head. I know. Why don't we make a family tree? Good idea, their mother said. They got out some construction paper and colored pencils and spread them out on the kitchen table. I'm going to put a ship next to Alice Larson's name to show how she came over from Sweden, Alice said. As she drew, she tried to imagine what it had been like for her great-great-grandmother to leave her country forever, to cross the ocean on a huge ship and not know what she would find on the other side. Was her whole family on the voyage with her? Alice asked. Her mother shook her head. She was only 16, but she was alone on her trip. Her parents had died back in Sweden, so she started out by herself. Your great-aunt Amanda, Alice's granddaughter, once told me that Alice had met a young man on the ship, but something happened and it didn't work out between them. But she met someone else, right? Asked Alice as she finished coloring the ship. The father of the first set of twins? Yes, her husband's name was George, her mother said. George Johnson. Alice wrote that down next to Alice Larson's name and made a little heart between the two names to show they were married. Then she drew 2 lines under the heart, each one a branch of the family tree. And the first twins' names were Elizabeth and Jessamine? Her mother nodded, and Alice printed the twins' names under the lines she had drawn. Laura looked over at Alice's tree and printed the same information on her own paper, struggling with the letters she was just beginning to master. I wish you girls had known my grandmother, Jessamine. She died just before Nancy was born, the girl's mother said. She was really something. Lots of fun, even a little wild. Sometimes she seemed more like a kid than a grandparent. When she was only 16, she ran away and joined the circus as a bareback rider. Wow, neat, Alice said. And what about Elizabeth? Her mother frowned. Elizabeth died in a riding accident. I don't know many of the details, because my grandmother didn't like to talk about it. Alice felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She might fight sometimes with Nancy and Laura, but if anything happened to them, she didn't know how she would be able to bear it. Still, she wouldn't mind if Nancy were a little less bossy. Her older sister wasn't making a family tree, but that didn't stop her from telling Alice what to do. You left out the brother, Nancy said. Jessamine and Elizabeth had an older brother. He died of some awful disease that people got a lot back then. His name was Stephen, their mother confirmed. He died when he was just a baby, of scarlet fever, I think. Like Beth in Little Women, Alice said, remembering how hard she had cried when Beth had died. It was even more tragic to find out that one of her own ancestors had died of the same thing. She wrote down Stephen's name and drew a little angel over it. "What picture are you going to put for Jessamine and Elizabeth?" Laura asked, trying to copy the angel. Alice thought for a moment, then sketched a picture of a horse. At first, it looked too much like her puppy, Pounce. She erased and redrew until she was satisfied. Then she colored it in with a maple-colored crayon and added a black mane. Her mother looked over at her handiwork. "That's beautiful, Alice. I think you have a real artist's eye." Alice smiled and blushed. It was her secret wish to grow up to be an artist or designer. "Yeah, it's not bad," Nancy agreed, but she forgot to put Mom's grandfather, Jessamine's husband. "I was just about to ask about him," Alice said, shooting Nancy a dirty look. "Mom, what was his name?" Taylor Watson." "And they had Grandma Samantha, Great-Aunt Amanda, and Great-Uncle Harry?" Alice asked. "That's right." Alice added the next generation to the family tree, linking Samantha to Jack Lewis with a heart. Next to Samantha's name, she drew a movie screen surrounded by red curtains dotted with silver stars. She decorated Great-Aunt Amanda's name with a book. She knew her great-aunt had at one time taught English at Sweet Valley High. The next generation was simple. From Grandma Samantha and Grandpa Jack's names, she drew a branch for her mother. Marjorie Lewis, she printed. She made a heart and added her father's name, Charles Robertson. Her mother gave a little laugh. "I'm curious to see what you're going to draw for us, Alice." "That's easy," Alice said. "I'm going to make a plane to show how you and Dad met when he had to bail out near your town in France." She drew slowly and carefully. Then she added the final 3 branches of the family tree for her, Nancy, and Laura. But she was careful to leave space at the bottom of the page. One day she would be able to fill in the spot where her own family would go. Chapter 36. Late 1960s, Campus of the College of Southern California. The electric wail of Jimi Hendrix's guitar rattled the windows of the frat building. Multicolored strobes painted the partygoers with flashing rainbows of light. "Wow," Alice exclaimed. "Even Pi Iota Gamma is going psychedelic. Can you believe it?" She and Ginny Jenkins looked around the party in amazement. Alice had met Ginny at a campus meeting of Women for Peace, and they had been friends ever since. "The times they are a-changing," Ginny said, quoting the Bob Dylan song. "I never thought I'd see the day when these squares join the revolution." Her dangling silver earrings jangled as she shook her head. "But maybe it's just skin deep." Alice laughed. "Jen, we're supposed to be here to make peace with these guys. Can't you give them the benefit of the doubt?" But she wasn't sure Ginny was so wrong. Pi Iota Gamma was the most conservative frat on campus. "Well, if I've got to give anyone the benefit of the doubt, I know who it's going to be," Ginny said. She pointed to a tall redhead disappearing into the crowd. "He might be totally off base about politics, but he sure looks cute in that tie-dye t-shirt. Mind if I go talk to him?" "Of course not," Alice said, running a hand through her long, white blonde hair. Her slender body swayed to the music as she watched Ginny go off after Mr. Tie-Dye. "Well, the lovely lady painter," said a voice behind her. Alice whirled around to find herself face to face with Hank Patman. His dark brown hair was cropped as short as always around his face, but he donned a string of beads to be more in tune with the feeling on campus. The first time Alice had seen Hank, back during freshman orientation week, she had thought he was impossibly handsome, but as she'd gotten to know more about him, he seemed less and less her type. "Hi, Hank," she said, politely but distantly. "Welcome to my party," Hank said, as if he were single-handedly throwing the entire Pi Iota Gamma bash. "Haven't seen you around campus much lately. Are you spending a lot of time in your painting studio?" "Enough," Alice said guardedly. Since when did Hank Patman talk about anyone but himself? "Well, it's a great hobby," Hank said. Alice felt a surge of annoyance. "Hank, my painting is not just a hobby. Women have professions too, you know." Hank chuckled. A girl like you? You're too pretty to work. Hank, Alice said through clenched teeth, get serious. Hank leaned forward and put a hand on Alice's shoulder. I am serious, he said. In fact, you're more than pretty. You're beautiful. Alice shook off Hank's hand. He might be handsome, but he was a real loser. Hank, why don't you go greet some of your other party guests? She suggested. She turned on her heel and walked away from him. Alice watched the frisbee sail up into the blue, cloudless sky. Stretched out on the grass, her long Indian print skirt spread out around her, she tried to capture the frisbee's spinning orbit on her sketch pad. No, that wasn't right. It looked like the boys she had drawn were playing catch with a flying hamburger. She erased her pencil work and tried again. That was more like it. Nice drawing, a familiar voice said. Very nice. Hank Patman was standing over her, watching her sketch. Thanks, Alice said, a note of suspicion in her voice. I mean it, Hank said. There's something about the way you work your lines that reminds me of some of Degas's sketches. Degas? Alice was surprised to find out Hank knew something about art. Surprised and, she had to admit it, a touch flattered. The French Impressionist was one of her favorite painters. Sure, you know how he liked to draw dancers and horses and capture the feeling of movement and motion? That's what you're doing by sketching these guys tossing around the frisbee. Thanks, Alice repeated. This time she was less suspicious. Hank clearly noticed the change in her voice and took it as a sign to sit down next to her. Alice was immediately sorry she had let down her guard. Hank drew so close that their arms touched. You should come over to my family's home sometime, he said. We have several Degas's, and the work of many other great painters, of course. Alice rolled her eyes. Of course, she echoed. What a braggart this guy was. But then, Los Angeles isn't very far away, and it has an excellent museum where I can see all the great paintings I want. Yes, I know the museum's collection well, Hank said. Father is on their board of directors. Oh, brother, Alice thought. Didn't Hank ever give it a rest? She closed her sketchbook and put it away in her fringed shoulder bag. It's been nice chatting with you, Hank, she said, as she got up, but I have a lot of schoolwork to do. Excuse me. Hank got up, too. Yes, I suppose you would have quite a bit of work, staying on the dean's list every semester. That's one of the things I admire about you. Some of these other students are too busy playing Revolution to bother with school. It's really just laziness. There's nothing wrong with trying to make the world a better place, Hank. You should try it sometime. See you later. I'm starved, Ginny moaned. She and Alice sat cross-legged on the floor of one of the offices in the administration building. Students were everywhere. A couple in faded bell-bottom jeans and bare feet were reading nearby. Other kids sat talking in small groups. Over by the windows, a boy with a long ponytail was strumming his guitar, and people were singing the chorus of We Shall Overcome. I'm starved too, Alice said. She could feel her stomach growling. She hadn't eaten anything since the chocolate-covered marshmallow moon pie she had bought from a vending machine in her dorm the previous afternoon. Do you think it would be awful if we sneaked out of here for a pizza? Ginny whispered. Alice's mouth started watering at the thought of a bacon and onion pizza smothered with spicy tomato sauce and cheese. She groaned. Don't even say that, Jen. Well, look, Alice, how many people do you think are in this building? Ginny asked. There are 20 or 30 of us here in this room, right? And this is only one of dozens of offices full of students. Do you really think anyone would miss us if we left? Jen, we can't, Alice said, wishing her stomach would stop making noise. It's the principle of the thing. I mean, what if everyone started sneaking out? The administration would win. And you know how unfair it was of them to fire Professor Yarovich. If he hadn't been such a vocal civil rights activist, he'd still be teaching. Jenny sighed. You're right. I just don't know how much longer I can hold out. I mean, I thought a sit-in was going to be sort of like a big slumber party, you know? It never occurred to me that the administration would get dirty enough to cut off all the deliveries to the building and try to starve us out of here. That's all the more reason to stick it out, Alice said. But she knew that sooner or later she was going to have to give in. The students couldn't win this battle without food to keep them going. Maybe we should try memorizing some more French verbs, she suggested. That should take our minds off how hungry we are. She dug around in her fringed bag for her French text. Je mange, tu manges, il et elle mange, Ginny said, conjugating the verb to eat. Alice, French verbs are just no substitute for a turkey pot pie, or 2 or 3. Jen, would you please shut up about pizza and pot pies and just conjugate the verb devoir, Alice said, choosing a difficult verb to keep Jenny busy. Jenny's conjugation and the singing across the room were suddenly drowned out by the sound of the air above the building being beaten by still wings. A helicopter, the boy with the guitar yelled. Alice felt her blood pumping fiercely. A helicopter? She jumped to her feet. What was the administration up to now? She felt as if she were on a battlefield. Should she take cover under a desk? Race for the nearest exit? Her breath came short and fast. A few moments later, she heard the sound of cheering coming from out in the hall. A girl with a red bandana wrapped pirate style around her head paused in the doorway just long enough to pronounce the magic word. Food, she said. Someone's dropping food onto the roof by helicopter. Right on, Ginny yelled, holding out her hand for Alice to slap her 5. They joined the mass migration up the stairs of the administration building and out onto the roof. Alice thought it looked like something from Woodstock, or at least what she imagined the music festival to have looked like. Up on the roof were hundreds of students in patched jeans and vests, shirts decorated with tiny mirrors or bright beads. A sea of flower children, arms stretched to the sky. Overhead, a chopper hovered, its propeller spinning out the sound of victory. From its open door, dozens of bags were being dropped, each attached to a tiny parachute. The chutes were painted with bold peace signs and bright flower power daisies. It's like manna from heaven, yelled a tall, frizzy-haired blonde girl. She caught one of the bags and ripped it open. Oranges and apples rolled out onto the roof. There were boxes of cookies, sandwiches, and containers of coleslaw and potato salad. There were even plastic forks and paper plates. Someone handed Alice a sandwich. She ripped open the plastic wrapping and bit into it. Plain old egg salad had never tasted so good. The roof was filled with sighs of pleasure, cheers, and laughter as the picnic began. It looked like some kind of race to see who could wolf down the most food in the shortest time. Some people ate with one hand and held the other one up with fingers in a V, flashing peace signs to the helicopter still hovering above them. As Alice started on the second half of her sandwich, a voice from the copter spoke through a bullhorn, filling the air. "Attention, attention," a man's voice said. Alice thought he sounded familiar. "A voice from heaven," said Jenny, talking with her mouth full. The voice from the air continued, "I will keep feeding the people until their demands are met." As the students around her clapped and cheered, Alice was rocked by a huge wave of surprise. "Jenny," she yelled in her friend's ear, barely able to believe what she was hearing, "I know that voice. You're going to freak out when you hear this, but the guy up in the helicopter is, get this, it's Hank Patman." The crowd was going wild. "Right on, power to the people," they shouted. Hank Patman was a hero. "I heard his father threatened to cut off his inheritance if he made that food drop," Jenny said. She sat across from Alice in the CSC snack bar. Alice took a sip of coffee. "Yeah, I heard that too. The word sure gets around fast." "Almost as fast as Hank Patman changes stripes," Jenny commented. "I wonder what made him switch to our side all of a sudden." Alice shrugged. "Do you think it's for real, or do you think he's up to something sneaky?" Jenny sipped her tea. "Look, the way I figure it, the Patmans are worth millions, right?" "I guess," Alice agreed. She had heard that Hank's house was an estate with dozens upon dozens of rooms, surrounded by sculptured gardens and fountains and acres of woods. It was said that his father had business and political connections that stretched to every corner of the globe. "Well, I don't think Hank would risk losing his entire inheritance if he weren't serious about what he was doing," Jenny said. "I guess you're right," Alice said. It's just that it seems like he's done a total about-face. Yeah, well, from what I know about Hank Patman, he's a pretty stubborn guy, Jenny said. Maybe it just took him longer to see the light. But now that he has, he's just as stubborn about being on our side. Alice finished Jenny's thought. Maybe you're right. Maybe Hank's stubbornness is turning out to be as much of a good quality as a bad one. He did help us get Professor Yarovich reinstated, Jenny said. Alice drank the last few sips of her coffee in silence, thinking about the change in Hank Patman. Jen, she finally said, Hank's been asking me out. Still? Jenny asked. Boy, that guy's persistent, isn't he? Alice nodded. I keep waiting for him to give up, keep trying to discourage him. But now she felt herself blushing. Well, he is cute, Jenny said. Really cute. Yeah, he is, Alice agreed. And he knows a lot about art, too. Jenny grinned, and the flower she painted on her cheek with body paint dimpled up. Go for it, Alice. You're the one who's always telling me to give people the benefit of the doubt, right? Alice nodded slowly. Okay, maybe I will give Hank a chance. A giggle bubbled up in her throat. If anyone had told her a few weeks earlier that she'd be thinking about going on a date with Hank Patman, she wouldn't have believed it. But then again, the first time she had set eyes on him, he had been just what Alice had been dreaming about. Chapter 37. They were perched high above the ocean. Soft candlelight graced their corner table, glinting off the cut crystal vase filled with fresh flowers. Below them, the waves broke rhythmically on the shore. The lulling sound rose up through the darkness to the restaurant up on the cliff. Out on the water, the lights of a ship sparkled like faraway Christmas decorations. To peace, Hank toasted, holding up a glass of sparkling cider. To peace, Alice seconded. And to Russian caviar, Hank added. Alice agreed, setting down her glass to help herself to another triangle of toast, thick with tiny black pearls of caviar. They were silky on her tongue, exploding into rich bursts of the flavor of the sea. It's the best caviar in the world, Hank said. Alice rolled her eyes and laughed. Hank, isn't second best ever good enough for you? Hank shook his head. Absolutely not. I know you think I'm a show-off, Alice, but I wish you would see that you've got it wrong. It's just that I appreciate the finest things in life. As an artist, you should understand that. Alice took a sip of cider. I'm not sure I know what you mean, Hank. Well, say you're in a museum. The Louvre, maybe. The Louvre, in Paris. Hank nodded. Say I've taken you there for the weekend. Alice laughed. Hank, it's only our first date, and you're already got me going to Paris with you? Does it sound so terrible? Hank asked. Alice grinned and shook her head. No, I've always dreamed of going to Paris. Okay, then. We're in Paris. We go to the Louvre. In one room there are several canvases by Da Vinci. By Leonardo da Vinci? You mean we're in the same room with the Mona Lisa? Alice said. She felt a tingle of excitement. Exactly, Hank said. There are also several works by less well-known artists. Which paintings do you look at? Maybe I take a good look at everything, Alice said. I might never get another chance to go to the Louvre, and some of those other artists might turn out to be awfully good, too. Hank grinned. Stick with me, Alice, and you can go to the Louvre any time you want. But all right, I can see I have to be careful about the examples I use with you. Let's say you decide you do like the Da Vinci's best of everything in the room. That could happen, couldn't it? Alice laughed. I guess I'm just playing devil's advocate. The truth is, I think Da Vinci was a genius. But what does that have to do with your taste for the world's best caviar? Well, listen, wouldn't you spend more time looking at Da Vinci's work than anyone else's? Well, sure, Alice admitted. I guess I would. That's what I thought. You look at the best paintings, the ones you like best. Same thing as ordering the best caviar or driving the coolest red Mustang. It's just a matter of good taste. Alice laughed. Hank, don't you think that's stretching the comparison a little? Hank laughed along with her. Maybe, but I do know one thing. His voice grew serious. If I were used to settling for second best, I never would have gotten up the courage to keep asking you out. Alice felt her face grow pink. I'm glad you finally said yes, Hank whispered, leaning across the table and taking Alice's hand. His touch was soft and gentle, and Alice found herself surprised by how nice it felt. Hank looked more handsome than ever, his deep blue eyes, high cheekbones, and chiseled features warmed by the candlelight. You are the best, the most beautiful, Hank said. Thanks for giving me a chance. Alice felt her heart flutter. I'm happy I did. I think I was wrong about you, Hank. I was really impressed at the way you came through during the sit-in. You were a real hero. Hank shook his head. No, Alice, you were the hero. Me? But I was just one of the crowd. You were the one who saved us all from having to back down in defeat. Because you told me to do it, Hank said. Alice wrinkled her forehead in confusion. How could I tell you anything? I was inside the administration building all day, dreaming about my next meal. Don't you remember that day you were sketching those two guys playing frisbee? Hank asked. Alice nodded, feeling a little ashamed about how rude she had been to Hank that day. Well, you told me I should try doing something good for the world, Hank said. It got me thinking, so I'd say most of the credit for that food drop at the sit-in goes to you. Really? Alice said. She felt extremely flattered. Really, Hank said. Alice looked into his eyes, feeling his hand on hers. Maybe she had misjudged Hank Patman. Far out, Alice said. The live sound of the Electric Blues Band filled the campus. CSC's South Bowl had been transformed into a moving patchwork of people. Many kids were dancing. Others had spread out blankets on the grass and were lying in the sun. Music poured out of the huge loudspeakers that had been set up on either side of the makeshift stage. Alice and Hank spread their woven Mexican blanket out at the edge of the crowd under the shade of a thick-trunked leafy tree. Alice kicked off her sandals and grabbed Hank's hand. Let's dance, she said, half singing her words to the beat of the music. Hand in hand, they zigzagged through the throng of people, making their way closer to the stage, where the wildest, most free-spirited dancing was going on. Patman, called a heavy-set boy with a leather headband. He flashed a peace sign. Hi, Hank, a short girl in an embroidered peasant dress said. Hey, Hank Patman, a deep voice yelled out. Patman, haven't seen you around the frat enough lately, said a boy Alice recognized from Pi Iota Gamma. Alice held tight to Hank's hand. You're a real big man on campus since the sit-in, she said with a laugh. And before the sit-in, Hank said, people have always known who I was. Alice groaned. Hank certainly had his impossible side, but she had to admit that he was very smart and quite sophisticated, and he liked her an awful lot. After nearly a semester of dating him, Alice's pulse still raced at Hank's good looks. His straight dark hair had grown longer since they had started seeing each other, and he traded in his establishment clothes for a pair of patched bell-bottoms and a groovy vest. He was a good dancer, too. He and Alice joined the crowd near the stage, the motions of the dancers riding the electricity of the music. Great song, Hank yelled as the band went into a cover of Good Lovin'. Alice let the music sing through her body, following the rhythms of the band and the crowd. Up on stage, Jim Barton, the lead guitarist, went right from the last chords of Good Lovin' into a tune the band had written called Turn It On. Alice spun around and around to the wavering, vibrating notes until she grew dizzy. The sun was warm on her face. The grass and ground were soft under her shoeless feet. She sang out the chorus of Turn It On, her voice blending with the band and the voices of the people around her. As the band wailed out the final notes of the song, Jim Barton stepped up to the mic. We'd like to dedicate the next song to someone in the audience, he announced, running a hand through his long, wavy blonde hair. The bass guitarist went into the lead riff of the band's best song, Will You Love Me Forever? Whistles and cheers met the notes. The drummer added a pulsing beat. Jim Barton positioned his fingers on his guitar. To Alice, he said, strumming his first chord of the song. Alice's attention was riveted to the stage as Jim Barton spoke her name. But he had to mean some other Alice. She had never even met the Electric Blues lead guitarist. From Hank, he added. He did mean her. Alice turned and held Hank's gaze. For me? She felt her heart pounding along with the drummer's rhythm. Oh, Hank, she said, as he drew her close. Will you love me forever? The band sang. Share my life forever? Will you? Hank whispered in Alice's ear. He reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out a tiny enameled jewel box. Alice felt as if she were in a dream. She took the jewel box from Hank and held it unopened, feeling the promise inside and feeling the joy of the moment. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. Go ahead, Hank said, giving her a light kiss on her forehead. Alice flipped open the box. A diamond ring winked in the sunlight in its nest of black velvet. It took her breath away. Will you, Alice? Hank asked. Will you marry me? Please say you will. Alice was overwhelmed by music and love. Yes, yes, I will, she said. I'll share my life with you, Hank Patman. I love you, Alice, Hank said. He slipped the ring on her finger. Chapter 38. Alice wished with every nerve in her body that she was seeing a mirage rising out of the wavy, hot air above the sand. But she knew this was for real. Hank, her fiancé, the boy who had promised to love her forever, was walking along the water with his arm around a tall, striking brunette in a tiny polka-dot bikini. Alice's first thought was to turn and run in the other direction. She could hear the happy voices and the music on the beach behind her. She could go back to the party, try to forget what she had seen. How awful it would be to run right into Hank with another girl. What would she say? What would she do? Wait, she told herself. Why was she worrying about what she would say to Hank? What about what Hank had to say to her? She felt the weight of the oversized diamond on her finger. How could he do this to her? She willed herself forward. Her feet sank deeply into the soft, wet shore. Her steps were heavy. Hank and a beautiful brunette. Hank and another woman. She squinted into the sun at them. Her eyes hurt. Hank was looking at the girl and laughing. The sound rippled along the edge of the water, breaking over Alice in a wave of anger. How dare he? How dare Hank Patman? Hank took his eyes off the girl for a moment. Alice felt his glance come to rest on her. She held her breath. Then, casually, the smile still on his face, Hank took his arm from around the brunette's shoulder and waved it over his head at Alice. Alice could not believe it. Hey, hello, Hank called. As Alice met up with them, a powerful wave crashed onto the shore. The brunette gave a little jump, squealing and giggling as they were hit with a spray of salt water. Alice, do you know Brenda? Brenda, Alice. Hi, Brenda said sunnily. Hello. Alice heard her voice come out as cold as the ocean's depths. She knew it was really Hank she was angry with, but she couldn't help feeling icy toward Brenda in her little bikini. Hey, Brend, why don't you go enjoy the party, Hank said. Groovy, Brenda said. Sounds happening back there. See ya, Hank. See you, Alice. Alice watched Brenda skip down the beach in her bikini. Having fun, Alice? Hank asked, slinging his arm around her, the same arm that had been around Brenda just a moment before. Alice shrugged away from Hank's touch. You know, Hank, you've barely talked to me all afternoon. My most loyal companion at this party is the refreshment table you set up on the sand. And then I come looking for you, and I find you with... She stumbled over her words and felt her lower lip tremble. With Brenda? Hank was the picture of innocence. Alice, she's my friend. You don't mind if I spend some of my spring break bash with my friends, do you? Alice gave a tight shrug. Maybe if you hadn't looked quite so friendly. Whoa, Alice! What happened to the idea of peace and love? Everyone loving one another. You're the one who's turned me on to that, babe. Did you call Brenda babe, too? Alice asked. Hank let out a long breath. Geez, Alice, why are you starting all this? Don't you want to have any fun at my party? What do you care, Hank Patman? The only person you care about having fun is you, Alice yelled.
Fine, Alice, be that way, Hank yelled back. It's your own fault for coming after me and spying on me.
Spying? Alice was outraged. The fact is, I was looking for you because I missed you, but right now I can't imagine why.
Look, Alice, if you're going to yell at me, I'm going to go back to the party and groove on some mellower people, Hank said.
He started walking. Fine, Alice called after him. Her blood was boiling. The sheer nerve of him, the sheer selfish, pig-headed nerve. She felt like screaming. Instead, she picked up a rock from the water's edge and flung it out over the ocean with all her might. Take that, Hank Patman, she said, channeling all her angry energy into her throw. The rock dropped with a splash, disappearing forever to the ocean floor. She picked up another rock and threw again. She watched it sink. The bullseye ripples spreading out around where the rock had pierced the water's surface were twisted by the strong current. There was something satisfying about seeing the water swallow up the stones. The ocean was so vast, so inhumanely powerful. One little lover's quarrel was dwarfed to invisibility by its scale and scope. Against the largeness of nature, Alice's problems seemed tiny. Alice had the sudden urge to plunge herself into the ocean like one of those stones, to feel her hot anger cooled by the water, rocked away by the waves. She waded in up to her thighs, waited for the next big swell, and dived into the curl. She surfaced for a breath of air and swam out to meet the next wave. She pulled against the current with her arms, ducking waves and swimming out further. With each stroke she felt calmer. Her body surrendered its tension to the movement of the water. She swam out past where the waves were breaking. The sounds of the party grew fainter and were replaced by the rush of wind over the water's surface. She kept swimming, and swimming. Her arms stroked through the water. Her legs fluttered in rhythmic, lulling kicks. Farther and farther out she swam. She flipped over on her back and floated, resting. The wispy clouds overhead seemed to sway as the water rocked her one way, then another. She floated for a long time, her mind emptying itself of anger. She turned back over, treading water as she looked toward shore. The partygoers were like tiny dolls. She headed in. She didn't want to get any further out. She swam with the sure, strong stroke she had learned from years on the Sweet Valley swim team, surging forward smoothly. The kids at the party came into clearer focus. She could hear the laughter and music once again. She found herself scanning the beach for Hank. Should she try to make peace with him, or should she let him come to her? There he was, getting in on a volleyball game with some of the guys from his frat. As Alice's thoughts returned to the problem of Hank, she felt herself being pulled away from shore by a strong undertow. She worked against the current, using all her strength to power herself forward. But the shoreline continued to recede. She pumped her arms through the water and kicked furiously, grabbed by a surge of panic. Suddenly, there was a stab of pain in her side. Her whole body contracted involuntarily around the cramp. Her knees jerked in toward her chest. She doubled over, somersaulting under the water's surface. She battled against the cramp, battled to come up for air, but the strong current tugged her down. She wrestled against its pull. She beat at it, desperate to surface for a breath. Oh no, I can't get up to the surface, she thought in a panic. She was no match for the violent sea. It toppled her dizzily so that she didn't know which way was up. She felt it squeezing out her final seconds. A breath. I must breathe. And then she could resist no longer. Alice inhaled the salty, furious ocean. It was the last memory she had. She stared into the depths of his brown eyes. He brushed a tendril of wet hair off of her forehead with strong, gentle fingers. His face was etched with concern and caring. Alice managed a weak smile. The young man smiled back, and she couldn't help noticing how handsome he was. The high cheekbones, the strong, straight line of his nose, the cleft of his chin. She tried to sit up, but she felt drenched to her very core, too heavy with water to move.
The young man whispered. Don't try to move yet. You have to rest.
Alice tried to figure out what had happened. There had been the strong current pulling her out to sea, that stab of pain in her side, and then blackness. There was nothing. No memory, no feeling until now, looking into the eyes of this young man. As Alice studied him more carefully, she noticed that he was as soaked as she was. His dark hair dripped salt water into his handsome face. Around them, a small crowd of partygoers was gathering. "What happened?" asked a strawberry blonde in a hot pink two-piece suit. Concern filled her voice.
She'll be okay, the dark-haired young man said. She got into a little trouble in the water. I pulled her out.
Pulled her out? That meant the young man had saved her life. Alice looked into his eyes again, and again he smiled that wonderful smile, full of caring and tenderness. There was something so familiar about it, so comfortable about the way he held her gaze. Did they know each other? Alice tried to call up a name or a place where she might have seen him, but all she got was a vague but comforting sense that he wasn't a stranger. Perhaps it was the special bond of looking into the eyes of the person who had saved her life. He had saved her. Maybe that was why Alice felt this instant intimacy, as if she had known him forever.
Alice, good heavens, said a voice that was familiar in a much more immediate way.
Hank. Alice sat up.
Alice, are you all right?
Alice took in the worry etched on Hank's face. She nodded weakly. I almost drowned out there, but this boy saved me. The boy stood up and offered Hank his hand.
Ned Wakefield, he said.
Ned Wakefield. Ned Wakefield. It did sound familiar, but Alice had no idea why. Hank clasped Ned's hand.
I'm Hank Patman. I owe you my deepest thanks. You don't owe me a thing, Ned said. He leaned down and looked at Alice. How are you feeling?
All right, Alice said. She could feel her strength starting to return. By the way, I'm Alice Robertson, and Alice's sentence trailed off. What did you say to someone who had saved your life? She felt a hint of dizziness again as she looked at Ned Wakefield. I've never had anyone save my life before.
Ned laughed. I've never saved anyone's life before. I'm just incredibly glad that I was coming down the beach at the right time.
Even Ned's voice was rich with that feeling of comfort and familiarity, Alice thought. But there was no time to ponder it. Hank was squatting down next to Alice.
Maybe I'd better take you home, he said.
He put his arm around her shoulder. Alice's attention shifted. She remembered the girl in the polka-dot bikini. I wouldn't want to spoil your spring break bash, she told Hank frostily. Hank looked as if he had been slapped.
Alice, please, let's not fight. When I saw you lying here, I knew that if anything happened to you, I could never live with myself. There will be other parties. The important thing is that you're going to be fine. I'm going to take you back to the dorm and make sure of it.
Alice could hear the sincerity in Hank's voice. She knew this was his way of apologizing. Maybe she was being too hard on him. She managed a small smile and let him help her to her feet. Her legs felt shaky, but Hank slipped a strong, supporting arm around her waist.
Are you okay? Hank asked.
I think so.
We'll take it slow, Hank said. He offered Ned his free hand. Thank you again. If there's anything I can do for you, just take good care of her.
Alice caught Ned Wakefield's familiar smile again.
I will. Bye. See you around campus, Hank said. See you, Ned said. He turned to Alice. Bye.
Bye, Alice echoed, and thank you. Thank you 1,000,000 times.
You're welcome 1,000,000 times, Ned said.
As they left him standing on the beach, Alice had a deep and unexplainably sad feeling. It, too, seemed strangely familiar. Chapter 39. There he was again. In the cozy, crowded dimness of the coffee house, Alice spotted him almost immediately. Maybe Ned Wakefield sensed her presence, too. As Alice and Ginny sat down at a tiny, round, wooden table at the back of the room, Ned swiveled around in his seat near the front, caught sight of Alice, and waved. She waved back. Up on stage, a moon-faced, curly-haired girl strummed her guitar and sang a sweet, simple version of Because All Men Are Brothers.
Boy, that guy is everywhere, Ginny whispered. Alice laughed softly. I know. I can't believe I never saw him before the day of Hank's party. I mean, now every rally I go to, I see him. Half the time I'm in the library, he's studying next to me. Lunch at South Hall, he's there. Cynthia Grant told me he was at the sit-in, too, down in the dean's office giving legal advice to the people who were organizing the whole thing. Pre-law, huh? Ginny said. Well, I guess it's good to have some of those on our side. Plus, he's pretty cute. Boy, I wouldn't have minded having his arms around me, rescuing me from the ocean like some hero in the movies. Alice was glad it was smoky and dark in the coffee house, and that Ginny couldn't see her blushing. Jen, I was unconscious while Ned was pulling me out. I wasn't aware of anything. As she spoke his name, Alice could feel her face growing even warmer. She busied herself by rummaging around in her fringed bag for her wallet. I'll go get us some coffee, she said, changing the subject. You want to split a cookie? Do you even have to ask? Ginny said. The coffee house was known for their homemade giant chocolate chip cookies, served hot from the oven. Alice wove her way through the tables of students toward the small counter where refreshments were sold. Hi, said a voice behind her. Alice knew who it was even before she turned and looked into those eyes. Hi, Ned. We meet again, Ned said lightly, but Alice could see an intensity in his eyes that gave him away. Would you and your friend like to join me? Alice hesitated, and Ned added, I've got a good table up front where you can see and hear really well, and the next singer who's performing is fantastic. Rob Morris, Alice said. Yeah, he's great. That's why my friend and I came tonight. He does a really amazing version of Blowin' in the Wind. Yeah, I love that song, Ned said. Alice felt a flush of warmth go through her body. It seemed the more she ran into Ned, the more it turned out they had in common. But she couldn't let herself fall under his spell. She reminded herself she was engaged to Hank. She loved Hank. In the weeks since the beach party, he had been extra attentive and sweet, as if making up for their fight. The tall boy in front of Alice moved away from the counter with a cup of tea. Alice ordered 2 coffees and a cookie. Can I get you something, Ned? She asked. Thanks, I'm set, Ned said. I just came over to see if you'd join me. It seems like we keep running into each other, but then all of a sudden you have to rush off someplace. I was hoping I could convince you to sit down for a while. Alice lowered her eyes and studied the plain, dark tiles on the floor. She felt torn. Ned, I'd like to say yes, but Ned sighed. It's Hank Patman, isn't it? Alice nodded. Alice, Ned said. Alice couldn't fight the thrill that went through her as she heard Ned say her name, but she wouldn't let herself look at him again. There was something about his eyes that was too familiar and intimate, too appealing, too dangerous. Alice, I know you hang out with Patman a lot, Ned said, but don't you think you could give me a chance? If you don't want to sit with me now, then let me take you out one night. Several months earlier, Alice would have said yes, but several months earlier, she hadn't been engaged to Hank Patman. It's not just hanging out, she explained to Ned. She held up her left hand. Her diamond ring sparkled even in the low light of the coffee house. I'm going to marry Hank Patman, she said. Ned's whole face melted into an expression of deep disappointment. Oh. In the uncomfortable space between them, Alice fumbled in her wallet for change for the girl behind the counter. Oh, I just didn't realize, Ned stammered. The girl set 2 steaming cups of coffee with milk on a tray with a cookie. Alice paid her and picked up the tray. It's okay, she said. She felt embarrassed, too. Well, Hank Patman is a lucky guy, Ned said politely. I wish you the best. Thanks, Alice said. Later in the evening, as the first chords of Blowin' in the Wind filled the coffee house, Alice noticed Ned looking back at her, smiling sadly. Alice, dear, hold still, her mother said, as the seamstress pinned the bottom of her hem. You don't want to be walking up the aisle with one side of your dress longer than the other, do you? Alice giggled, imagining one side of her frothy white gown as a miniskirt, while the other side billowed gracefully to the floor. It would be interesting, all right, but she didn't think the Patmans would be too happy about it.
Nothing short of the most traditional elegance would do for Alice's future in-laws. When they had first started planning the wedding, Alice had imagined a casual celebration, perhaps a clam bake on the beach or a simple outdoor brunch. But Hank's parents had insisted on a more formal affair, right down to Alice's wedding clothes. Alice stared at her reflection in the mirror on the back of her closet. A pearl-studded gown fell in voluminous folds around her ankles, lengthening into a small train at the back. Her headpiece was sewn with matching pearls and tiny flowers. She tried to get used to balancing on the tall, narrow heels of her white satin shoes. For a moment, Alice had the funny feeling that she was looking at some stranger in a bride's magazine who'd gotten into her bedroom. She was about to get married. Alice Robertson would soon be Alice Patman. She wouldn't really believe it until she was actually walking down the aisle on her father's arm to meet Hank. Out in the hallway, the phone rang. Then her sister Laura's voice called from downstairs. "Alice, it's for you." "Excuse me," Alice said to her mother and the seamstress. "I'll be right back." She went out into the hall to pick up the upstairs extension, feeling her full skirt swirl around her. "Hello," she said into the receiver. "Alice?" She knew the voice. It was Ned Wakefield. Alice felt herself growing hot under all the layers of material. "Ned?" "Yeah, it's me. I hope it's okay to call you at home like this." "Sure," said Alice. "It's fine. I haven't seen you around much lately." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Well, it wasn't just fate that we kept running into each other on campus," Ned finally said. "I mean, sometimes it was, but I helped it a little too. Looked for you, got to know where you'd be and stuff. After I found out you were getting married, well, I thought it might be better if I lay low." "Uh-huh," Alice said. She wondered if Ned knew she was getting married that weekend. "Anyway, maybe this is corny, but I just wanted to call you before the wedding and tell you that I'll never forget you," Ned said. She felt a shiver of pleasure. "I don't think it's corny at all," she said. "It's very sweet of you." "Alice, you're a special person," Ned said, his voice husky with emotion. "So are you," Alice said. And then, to cover her embarrassment, she quickly added, "I mean, how often does someone save your life?" "Well, I'll always be here for you if you need me," Ned said. "I mean it, and I hope you and Hank will make each other's lives very special." "Thank you, Ned," Alice said. "I hope you'll find someone to make you happy, too." There was a long silence. "Well, I guess I'd better go," she said finally. "Goodbye, Alice," Ned whispered. "Bye," Alice answered. She heard the click of his receiver. She hung up her own phone, but she didn't go back to the bedroom right away. She thought about Ned's words. "I hope you and Hank will make each other's lives very special." How different from what Hank had said when he had toasted her at their engagement party. "To the woman who will be by my side as I make my way in life." What a different way Ned Wakefield had of looking at marriage. A picture flashed through Alice's head like a bolt of lightning, strong and unstoppable. She was in her pearl-trimmed dress, walking down the aisle on her father's arm. But the man waiting for her was not Hank. It was Ned. "Stop," she told herself. "You're not marrying Ned. You're marrying Hank. You're going to be Mrs. Hank Patman." She turned and went back to her bedroom, her skirt swishing around her ankles. There would always be interesting men in the world, but she knew she could choose only one to share her life with, and Alice had chosen Hank. Alice felt as if a family of fluttering bats had moved into her stomach. She couldn't sit still. She paced the small room in the Patman's guest cottage over and over, making frequent checks in the full-length mirror from every conceivable angle. "Are you sure my headpiece is on straight?" she asked. "Is my hair sticking up under my veil? Are my steps too big for these high-heeled shoes? What about my lipstick?" "Alice, you look absolutely beautiful," Jenny reassured her. "Your hair's perfect," Nancy said. "You're perfect," Laura said. "It's your day, the happiest day of your life." "I know, but I'm so nervous," Alice said. "It's hot in here. When do you think they're going to start?" Part of her wanted the ceremony to begin as soon as possible, putting an end to her anxious waiting. Another part of her was so scared that all she could think of was, "Not yet." It was a funny feeling for the happiest day of her life. "Here, let's open a window," Ginny said. "You'd better try to relax. Hank's still out there milling around with the guests." She pushed the window up, and a gentle late afternoon breeze ruffled the curtains. "Ooh, he's coming this way. Don't look, Alice." Alice did exactly what Ginny told her not to do. "Oh, come on. Hank won't even see me. I'll just peek out from behind the curtain." "Alice," protested Laura, "the bride and groom aren't supposed to see each other before the wedding." Alice laughed nervously. "Laura, I'm going to spend my whole entire life with Hank. What's one little 2-second look going to do? I just want to see him once more before he becomes my husband." "Husband?" She shook her head. "Wow, can you believe it?" She pushed the curtain aside just enough to see out. The Patmans' lawn looked like the set for a movie about the perfect country garden party. Men in tuxedos strolled with elegant women in long, pale summer dresses. Waiters in equally fancy dress circulated among the guests, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres from silver trays. A huge screened-in tent had been set up. Inside it, many small tables were set with linen and crystal and fine china. Large bouquets of flowers graced every table. In the shade of the main house, a string quartet was playing. A few of Alice's friends stood out in their fluorescent miniskirts or patchwork vests, looking as though they had gotten lost on the way to a happening. Alice spotted her parents chatting with Hank's parents, elegant and proper in their formal dress. Her great-aunt Amanda stood near the musicians, listening to them play. Alice could hear the sweet notes of the violin coming in off the breeze. And there was Hank, his long hair curled over the collar of his tux. He wore a white rose in his lapel. Alice felt her heart skip a beat. Hank was so handsome. He was coming toward two frat buddies standing near the guest house window, his arms stretched out to them. "Joe, Seth," Alice could hear him say. He clapped each of them on the back. "Glad you could make it." "Hey, glad you thought to invite us, Pi Iota Gamma," said Seth. Or was it Joe? "We haven't seen much of you since you became a hippie radical." "Me? A hippie radical?" Hank snorted. "Cut out the nonsense." "Doesn't seem like nonsense. Look at all these flower children planted on your lawn." Hank shrugged. "Alice's friends." Alice felt a shiver of annoyance go through her. Weren't her friends Hank's friends now? "Patman, people say that you were the hero of the sit-in at the administration building back at the beginning of the fall semester," the other frat brother said. "Sounds fairly radical to me." "Joe, you know you're just jealous because it turned me into the biggest celebrity on campus," Hank said. "Bet you wish you'd come up with a scheme like that." A scheme? Alice felt her annoyance boiling into anger. Was it possible that all Hank's talk about doing good for the world was no more than a kind of publicity scheme? And what about that story that had spread around campus, the one that had Hank risking his inheritance to help the student cause? Suddenly, Alice had a terrible thought. What if Hank himself had started the rumor? It wouldn't be unlike him. Her sisters and Ginny were all looking at her with a mixture of sympathy and horror. "Wow," Ginny murmured, "that's pretty heavy." Alice felt as if the veil she was wearing had been over her eyes for far, far longer than she'd realized, and that it was just being lifted so she could see clearly. "Jen," she said, "could you go out there and tell Hank I'd like to talk to him?" She turned to her sisters. "Why don't you spend some time with Great Aunt Amanda?" The three other girls suddenly all seemed to remember why they were there. "Alice, maybe this isn't the right time to start a fight with Hank," Ginny said. Nancy nodded. "Yeah, don't let this spoil your special day, Al. Besides, it's bad luck for him to see you in your dress before the ceremony." Alice lifted the soft, gauzy veil. "Just go get him," she said. Her tone left no room for argument. A few minutes later, she could hear Hank's sure-footed step on the ceramic tile floor of the guest cottage. He pushed open the door to her room without knocking. "Alice, you know we're not supposed to see each other before the ceremony." Alice caught his tight expression in the reflection in the mirror. Then she saw it soften. "But you look so beautiful. God, Alice, you're a vision of the perfect bride." In the mirror, she saw Hank coming over to her, leaning toward her to kiss her. She took a giant step out of his reach. "Hank,
don't, she said quietly. What? You let me see you before the wedding, but you draw the line at kissing me? Hank said. He followed her step and bent his face toward hers. Alice turned her head, and Hank's lips grazed her cheek. Hank, I can't, she said. Can't kiss me? Alice shook her head. I can't go through with this. I can't marry you, Hank. Her words hung on Hank's stunned silence. She saw his handsome face crinkle into a grimace of pain. Alice felt a stab of pity. Hank might have many faults, but she didn't doubt that he loved her. What she was beginning to doubt was how much she could truly love him. What? Hank's disbelief reverberated off the walls of the small room. Hank, I'm really sorry, Alice said. She knew how flimsy her apology was. She thought of all the guests waiting expectantly as she and Hank stood there facing off, but she knew it wouldn't be fair to either of them to go through with the wedding. Alice, how can you do this to me? Hank yelled. The plans have been made for weeks. The celebration's already begun. Hank, this isn't about one party. It's about you and me spending our lives together, Alice said. As she spoke, she felt more and more firm in her decision. This wasn't about how she looked or whether her hair was properly coiffed or what her friends were wearing to the Patmans' perfectly elegant gathering. This was about the rest of her life. Hank paid no attention to Alice's words. Alice, what will my parents think? What will our guests think? You're going to make a laughingstock. His words shook with anger. Please, Hank, I can't tell you how bad I feel about this. Well, maybe on some level I knew it all along, but I was afraid to admit it. I just wish I'd realized sooner so I could have spared your feelings. Hank, forgive me. But Hank seemed less interested in feelings than he was in appearances. And what about Mother and Father? Mother has planned this entire affair. Father is already greeting our guests. How will it look for them? Alice told herself that this was Hank's way of avoiding the terrible hurt that was burying deep inside him. Still, it only made her more convinced that Hank was not the man for her. I'll try to explain to your parents, if it would make it any easier, she said gently. You'll do no such thing, Hank commanded. I don't want you near my parents. His glowering anger twisted his features into an ugly mask. In fact, I order you to leave the premises immediately. You order me? Alice looked at the man who could have been her husband. She was filled with disdain and anger, but she also felt deeply sorry for him. Just do as he says, she told herself. Walk away from him. It will be the best thing for both of you. You should have done it long ago. Without another word, she turned and left the room, teetering on her pencil-thin heels. As she stepped out the guest house door, one heel sank deep in the soft earth. Alice, what are you doing? She heard Laura's voice call out. Heads turned. Guests stared. Alice slipped her feet out of her uncomfortable shoes and left them, one heel piercing the Patmans' flawlessly manicured lawn. Suddenly, she was running. She gathered up her full skirt in one hand, feeling the tender carpet of grass underfoot through her sheer pantyhose. The breeze was sweet on her face. Alice, came the chorus of many different voices. Alice! Alice ran and ran. She was free. Chapter 40. U-V-W, Alice muttered to herself. Wade, Wagner, Waits, Wakefield. She knew she looked strange, standing in an open telephone booth in her wedding gown and stocking feet. She knew passers-by were staring, but she didn't care. Ned Wakefield, 33 Northview Drive. She committed the address to memory. It was a long, long walk, but every step felt like a step of liberation. The darkening sky seemed to be quietly singing the last act of Alice's relationship with Hank Patman. Twilight muted the tree-lined streets. By the time Alice reached Ned's neighborhood, darkness had set in, but the stars were bright and clear and a full moon lit the sky. Alice's gown shone pale and shimmery. An elderly man walking a wire-haired terrier gawked openly at her. Alice was getting used to the stares of curiosity. She tried a smile on the man and asked the way to Ned's house. She knew Northview was nearby, but she wasn't sure precisely where. The man gave her directions, then seemed to be considering saying something else. He looked down at Alice's feet, then at her dress again. "Dear, are you all right?" he finally asked. Alice laughed. "Yes, I'm fine. In fact, I'm the finest I've been in months." She patted his dog's back and thanked him for directions. She ran the last few blocks to Ned's. She found herself in front of a rambling white house with a big front porch. In the light of the street lamps, she could see that the house needed a paint job, but there was something comfortable looking about it. Once, when Alice had run into Ned on campus, he had told her that he shared it with several other students from CSC. Suddenly, she felt a shiver of nervousness. What if Ned didn't want to see her? What if she was disturbing him? What if he had somebody else over? Another girl, maybe. Then she noticed there was no light on in the house. What if he wasn't home at all? She raced up the front walk and took the porch steps 2 at a time, her wedding dress rustling loudly. She rang the doorbell and heard it sound inside the house. Nobody came to the door. She rang again and again. Her spirits sank. She left the porch and walked around to the side of the well-worn house, peering in through the ground floor windows, but it was hard to see anything in the dark rooms. Then Alice heard music coming from the rear of the house. Music? Someone was there. As she raced around to the backyard, she could make out the final verse of "Blowin' in the Wind." The song ended and there were a few seconds of silence. Then the same song began to play again from the beginning. Alice's heart soared. Ned was playing their song. She shaped her hands into a megaphone around her mouth. "Ned," she yelled. "Ned Wakefield? It's me, Alice. Ned, let me in. Ned, Ned." The lights in one of the upstairs rooms snapped on, and then Ned was bounding out the back door of the house, his arms already reaching toward Alice. She ran to meet him, and they melted into each other's embrace. Alice felt her feet leave the ground as Ned lifted her toward the clear, perfect night sky. She felt her heart's pounding against his chest. She breathed in his nearness, the perfume of his skin. His fingers traced her face, his caress soft and gentle. Alice returned his touch. Their lips met, and Alice felt the heavens come closer, and then they kissed again, and again, and again. Chapter 41. A number of years later. Sweet Valley. "Jessica?" Stephen Wakefield asked. He touched a chubby little toddler hand to the newborn in Alice's arms. She slept peacefully in a cocoon of a pink blanket. Then he touched the infant in Ned's arms, wrapped in a yellow blanket. "Izzy Beth?" The baby's tiny face squinched up, and she looked as if she might begin to cry, but the cry turned into a yawn, and her eyelids closed. Alice cradled the baby in one arm and pulled Stephen toward her on the bed with the other. "No, sweetheart, this one's Elizabeth. See, she has a tiny mole on her shoulder. Do you know what that means?" She pushed the pink blanket down just enough to show her son. "And Jessica here doesn't," Ned said. "Oh," Stephen said. "Dent call twins?" Alice laughed. "That's right, Stephen. Your sisters are identical twins. That means they look exactly alike. But you know what? Once you get to know them, I'll bet you'll discover all kinds of differences in your sisters, especially as they get a little older." She glanced over at the mantel above the fireplace, where an antique carved wooden rose was protected in a glass case. It had been a silent witness to the character of Alice's family for many, many generations. It was a miracle that Alice had given birth to twins, the third set in 6 generations. Now Alice wondered whether her daughters would inherit the bravery and independence of their great-great-great-grandmother Alice Larson, who had come to this country all by herself. Would they have their great-great-grandmother Jessamine's spirit of adventure, or great-aunt Amanda's big heart? Would either of them inherit their grandmother Marjorie's courage in the face of danger? Maybe her daughters would even be a little like her. The weathered old wood of the delicate flower, full of secret memories, held the past in its petals. Alice smiled at the infant in her arms, then leaned over and kissed the one in Ned's. In their perfect, identical faces, Jessica and Elizabeth Wakefield held the secrets of the future.